when we look outside the window and listen to Matt this morning, but you surely remember we had a rather warm summer this year.
This morning there's a warning that heat waves linked to climate change pose an increasing danger that threatens to overwhelm health services around the world.
Now, the number of people who've become vulnerable to extreme hot weather has risen steadily over the globe since 1990. In 2017, 157 million more people were exposed to heat waves than in the year 2000. And as a result, 153 billion hours of labour were lost because of heat exposure. And this latest report also found that people living in Europe are more at risk compared to those in Africa. And this is mainly due to more older people living in cities.
The guest is with us now. To talk to us is Dr. Nick Watts, who's the Executive Director of the Lancet Countdown report, co-author. I mean, there's a lot of material here. Can you try and condense it down? The link that people are trying to make between whether they're saying climate change. Make the link for us and about the effect on people's health.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a lot of information there. It's a very wide-ranging report. It's produced by 27 institutions from every single continent, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, University College London, Tsinghua University. To really simplify it down, what the report makes clear is that climate change is impacting the health of people around the world today. It's not something that we're talking about in 2050, by the end of the century. Absolutely, it's going to get worse, and all of our projections suggest that we're in for a rough ride, but we're seeing these health impacts today.
So what are the health impacts and how many people are affected?
Yeah. Everyone is affected. No country is immune. None of the patients that I would treat, none of the patients that anyone in the NHS would treat would be immune to the health impacts of climate change. They range anything from the extremes of heat that you've been talking about, the labour impacts that come from that, the kidney disease that comes from that extreme of heat, the exacerbation of congestive heart failure. But on the other hand, and you pointed out, it's actually a bit stormy outside. We expect to see more floods, stronger extremes of weather. As a result of climate change as well. The spread of infectious disease. The health impacts really touch on basically all of the good foundations of public health.
So in knowing that's happening, which sections of society or which types of countries are the most vulnerable?
Sure. And so specifically when we talk about heat, one of the things that this report highlights is that Europe is one of the most vulnerable populations with respect to heat. 42% of the population over the age of 65 vulnerable to extremes of heat.
Why is that? Is that because we're not used to certain levels of heat, or our infrastructure doesn't cope with it, or is it a problem with funding for our health services? What's the issue?
So let me be clear. It's not to say that Europe is uniquely or only affected. It's just that Europe is the most vulnerable, and this is basically a factor of our demographics. It's that there's an aging population. There are people aging and growing, migrating into the areas worst affected by climate change, and that those people come with all sorts of pre-existing conditions. Chronic kidney failure predisposes you to extremes of heat. Congestive heart failure, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. Now, on the other hand, you also mentioned the labour capacity loss that we see in India, in China, in Pakistan, all around the world, really. But 153 billion hours total. When we look at what that is in context, that's 1.4% of China's total labour capacity. It's 7% of India's total labour capacity.
Can I just put the other side of this story, which I guess Donald Trump would be, one of the spokespeople for, which is they're not convinced by the arguments about climate change. And what you're talking about is vagaries of weather.
Sure. I'm not sure I'm going to comment on what Donald Trump would or wouldn't say. But what I can say...
I wonder what he would say if you'd said, if you'd presented the evidence you'd presented to him.
Yeah.
I mean, it's important, whether it's interesting or not, whether it's true or not, it's important, yes, isn't it?
It's absolutely important, and it's certainly true. We see 97% of climate scientists, 97% of experts around the world in complete consensus. We no longer talk about whether or not climate change is happening. We talk about how soon, we talk about the health impacts, and we talk about how we can respond.
I really don't want people to feel the end is nigh, so to speak. Can we cope with it?
So there are two things that we have to do to respond to climate change. First, we have to make sure that our hospitals, that our doctors, that our nurses are prepared. We have to make sure that we're able to respond to these new extremes of heat, the floods, the extremes of weather that we're expecting to see, and there are ways to prepare for that. But there are also limits to that preparedness. There are limits to the adaptation that we can put in place. And so we also need to make sure that we're tackling climate change head on. reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the good news attached to that is, actually, when you look at all of the things that we want to do to respond to climate change, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, clean up the air, encourage physical activity, encourage healthy diets, they're just common sense public health interventions. We've seen a letter going today to the Prime Minister from many of the Royal Medical and Nursing Colleges calling for exactly these measures, calling for rapid phase out.
Very interesting. Thank you for your time this morning. Dr. Nick Watts is co-author of that report about climate change and the effect it's having on our health.
It's not, there's no heat wave here in the UK today. It's